Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Liane Henschke, Executive Director of the Tennessee World Affairs Council, a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization that promotes global literacy, international awareness, understanding, and connections to prepare Tennesseans to prosper in an increasingly complex and connected world. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Tom Standage, Deputy Director of The Economist and Editor of The World Ahead in 2025, hosted by our board member, Mr. Tim Douglas. This is part of our webinar series, Global Dialogue. Mr. Standage will present a top 10 trends to watch in 2025 and their implications for geopolitics, business, and culture in the year to come. This is the last webinar of this year, and I thank you all for attending our webinar series in 2024. Soon we are going to release the TINWalk calendar for 2025. Let me introduce the moderator of today's webinar. Tim Douglas currently serves as Regional Director of Private Banking for Nashville, Tennessee-based First Bank. He has been a banker for 8 years, but has an extensive and varied background in finance, from having worked in the financial and bond markets in New York City for a money center bank, to then working with a merchant banking and private equity boutique. He owned and managed a distributor and converter of adhesive products for 12 years, selling it to an Atlanta-based private equity firm. He later managed surgery centers for 4 years and worked briefly in the insurance business. He has a unique and valuable finance perspective as compared to most bankers. More on his bio at tnwac.org. I now turn it over to Mr. Douglas to introduce Mr. Standage and moderate the discussion. Please access the chat for questions. Thank you both, as well as the participants of today's webinar.
Thank you, Liane. And it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Standage, joining us today from London. He's Deputy Editor of The Economist, as Liane said, editor of its future-gazing annual, The World Ahead. He joined The Economist as science correspondent over 25 years ago in 1998 and was subsequently appointed technology editor, business editor, and digital editor. He's the author of 7 history books, including Writing on the Wall, The Victorian Internet, and the New York Times bestsellers, A History of the World in 6 Glasses, and An Edible History of Humanity. His latest book, A Brief History of Motion, was published in 2021. Tom studied engineering and computer science at Oxford University and has written for other publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Wired, taking a particular interest in technology's social and historical impact. Tom is going to speak, and I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to talk us through his top 10 themes that you see, Tom, for 2025, with Donald Trump returning to the White House. So, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take us through the top 10 themes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me once again. It's great to be here. Yes, so I wear many hats at The Economist, but the one I'm wearing at the moment is as editor of our Future Gazing Annual. And here you can see the latest edition and the previous editions that I've edited. We've actually been doing this annual for, I think this is the 38th or 39th year that it's happened. And I've been involved with it ever since I started at The Economist in 1998. So it's something we put together starting in May, and it involves contributions from journalists at The Economist, so the usual journalists who write for The Economist, And also we have our colleagues at the B2B arm of the Economist Group, the Economist Intelligence Unit. They give us specific forecasts for 15 industries and 81 countries. And then we also have guest contributors to this particular edition, to this to the annual, and we've always done this. We actually started doing guest contributors at the Economist more widely in recent years, but this is sort of where we started doing it. This year, our guests include Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, Edgars Rinkēvičs, who's the president of Latvia. And obviously, President Milei is best known because he's doing these quite dramatic financial reforms in Argentina, and economic reforms, and a lot of people are watching that and saying, what can other countries learn from that? Edgars Rinkēvičs, the president of Latvia, clearly is literally on the front line of concern about Russian aggression in Europe. Another guest contributor we have this year is Fei Li, who is an AI researcher at Stanford. She's known as the godmother of AI because it was a competition, an image recognition competition that she organized in 2012 that is now recognized as the starting point of the modern AI boom. And then we have a very interesting, another guest is an interesting entrepreneur called Casey Handmer. And he reminds me a lot of Elon Musk 20 years ago. I first met Elon Musk in 2003. And Casey reminds me a lot of him in a good way, the sort of the innovative entrepreneurial side of Elon Musk rather than the slightly crazier side that we've seen in the last few years. So I think he's definitely worth keeping an eye on. Anyway, I take all of the predictions and analysis and speculation of all of these different contributors, and I reduce it all to a top 10 of themes that I think are essentially representative of what we've got to say about the coming year. So what I'm going to give you now is essentially the live version of this editor's letter, which you can see here. And so let's jump into it. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that the biggest theme of the year is the uncertainty around the result of the US election. So we had this rather we've had a year of uncertainty in 2024 because we weren't sure how the election was going to go. It's been such a knife edge, and the polls were basically 50-50 for the last few months. Now, of course, we know that Donald Trump has won the election, but that hasn't actually resolved the uncertainty. In some ways, we're in a world where there's even more uncertainty because we don't know exactly what he's going to do. He said he's going to do a lot of things. He wants to impose big tariffs. He wants to essentially have a trade war with China. By doing this, he hopes to bring manufacturing back to America. He wants to deport millions of unauthorized immigrants. He says he's going to end the war in Ukraine in a single day. He says he wants to not just keep the tax cuts that he put in place in his first term, but actually extend them. And he wants to slash government spending with the assistance of Elon Musk. So these are all things he says he's going to do, and the big question is what he's actually going to do. And that's a very difficult question to answer. I think it's probably fair to say that he will do some version of some of these things, but we don't know which ones. And so that means there's room for enormous amount of uncertainty and enormous amounts of change. And, in every field from immigration to defense to economics to trade, these are policy decisions that will be made in the United States, but they will have global implications. And so this is an election that really the whole world is now we're waiting to see what Donald Trump does when he comes into office. I think this sort of scope for change, there's a broader point here, which is if you look at the elections that have happened throughout 2024, and it's been an unprecedented year for elections. There have been more people voting in more countries than at any other point in human history. And the theme that's come out of it is that incumbent parties, ruling parties around the world have done badly and have lost support. And this has happened regardless of their political orientation. So it's not just been the left wing or the right wing parties that have done badly, or it hasn't been like nationalists or green parties that have done well or badly. Everyone has done badly if they were already in power. And in some cases, the incumbent parties were actually chucked out of office, as has happened in America and in Britain. In other cases, they were forced into coalition, as we saw in India and South Africa. In some cases, they were pushed into cohabitation, which is where you've got the government of one party and the president of another party. And we saw that in Taiwan and South Korea. And in some cases, we've ended up with a minority government where, the biggest party still doesn't have a majority and has been unable to assemble a majority and is sort of soldiering on. That's what's happening in Japan, and it's what's been happening in France. But of course, the government there has just collapsed. So I think what this means is 2025 will be a year of expectations because people will be expecting the new leaders that they've elected to actually deliver on what they've promised, and they'll be expecting the humbled leaders who haven't done quite so well in their elections, but have clung on to power to maybe change their ways a bit. Some examples of this, I mean, in Britain here, we're really expecting the British government to deliver on its promise to boost growth, to rebuild ties with Europe, and to try and get the planning system sort of going again so that we can build more housing in particular. In South Africa, we have this quite interesting ruling coalition between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance. Will that remain stable? In India, Narendra Modi toned down the Hindu nationalism rhetoric a bit after his slightly, humbling election result. I mean, his coalition is still the biggest, but he doesn't have an outright majority on his own. But then more recently, he's won a state election, and so I think he feels that he can go back to things the way they were. But of course, the biggest change of all is in the US because nobody has promised more change on a more dramatic scale than Donald Trump. And I think that's really emblematic of what voters have been going for this year. They have said, change is what we want. We're in the market for leaders who will shake things up, and that's very much what Donald Trump has promised. So I think the question is whether he will deliver on the things he's promised. Which ones will he prioritize? How far will he go? And one of the big questions there is on foreign policy. So Donald Trump has a very transactional approach to foreign policy, and this means that America's friends and foes alike are waiting to see exactly what happens to America's alliances, both in Europe and in Asia. And I think the earliest test of what Donald Trump's going to do differently on foreign policy is going to be with Ukraine. He says he's going to end the war within a day. It's generally assumed that his plan is to say that he's going to stop providing any aid to Ukraine and propose a deal that lets Russia keep the territory it's conquered. And it's certainly, I think, the case that Ukraine and Russia, neither of them really wants to keep fighting. But on the other hand, is there some kind of position that they would both accept? We don't know. The big question, I think, is if there is going to be a kind of land for peace deal like that, is will America provide security guarantees to Ukraine to deter Russia from just coming back again in a few years' time and trying to take a bit more of the country? And I think if there was some kind of security promise, then that would enhance America's credibility and Donald Trump's credibility. But if he just pushes Ukraine into a deal that leaves it vulnerable to future Russian aggression, then Vladimir Putin will basically have won. He'll have made his point that the old rules-based order doesn't mean anything anymore. You can just sort of help yourself to a neighboring country, and no one's going to stop you. And if that happens, then Ukraine's survival will depend on whether European powers can step up to defend it, and that's a test they are likely to fail. It would also send a signal, I think, that American promises are empty. If America says that it's quite happy to let Russia help itself to a chunk of Ukraine, that would encourage troublemaking by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, aka CRINC, or the Quartet of Chaos. And we're seeing those four authoritarian powers essentially coordinating. They're not really an alliance, but they're certainly coordinating their actions more and more. And so it would send a clear signal to China, for example, that if it wanted to get into a fight with say the Philippines in the South China Sea, that America might not come to its aid. In the Middle East, we can expect Donald Trump to give Israel a free hand in its conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon, where there is this ceasefire that doesn't seem to be particularly stable. And the point that those around Donald Trump make is that America is overstretched and it needs to focus on its rivalry with China, which means being less engaged in the Middle East and Europe, and encouraging European powers in particular to take more responsibility for their own defense. And that makes sense. But as I say, the really unclear thing is whether, given Donald Trump's more transactional approach, what would happen in Asia. And in particular, if China attack Taiwan, which is something that could plausibly happen during Donald Trump's second term, would he step in? Would he defend Taiwan? The fact that we don't know is something that Donald Trump thinks works to his advantage. And this is sometimes called the madman theory of international diplomacy. Apparently, there was a phone call between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping in 2020 when Donald Trump said, "Don't try anything with Taiwan or we'll bomb the hell out of you." And that kind of threat, and the fact you don't know whether he's serious or not, you don't know what he'd do. The idea is that that has a deterrent effect. And Donald Trump talks a lot about how in his first term, America didn't get involved in any new wars, and so he seems to think that there is a sort of real deterrent effect there. But I think the challenge is going to come quite early in his presidency. We're likely to see provocative moves by both Russia and China to really test whether he's going to stand behind his allies. And if Donald Trump's unpredictability just comes to be seen as empty bluster, that could actually embolden America's autocratic foes. So foreign policy is one big area of uncertainty where we're not quite sure how Donald Trump's going to change America's position. And then the other big one is economics. For the time being, I think a rivalry, conflict with China is going to just take the form of rivalry over trade, and Donald Trump has talked about imposing big tariffs on China, but also on all other countries as well, including America's allies. And the big question is how far he'll go. Will he really impose a 60% tariff on Chinese goods imported to the US and 10 to 25% on imports from other countries? He's also talked about 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico. This could just be a negotiating ploy, and in fact he announced this 25% threat before he's even got into the Oval Office, and then immediately had a phone call with the president of Mexico, suggests that he is trying to get concessions out of countries, and this is how he's using the tariffs. And if he actually went ahead with these very, very broad tariffs, the result could be really disastrous for trade and for economic growth, both in America and elsewhere. Last time America tried tariffs, sort of universal tariffs on this scale, was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, when global trade then fell by 2/3, and that's now a byword for economically disastrous policy making. So we hope that he doesn't really mean it. Analysts reckon that a 10% universal tariff would knock 1 percentage point off America's growth. So it would hit American growth. It would also hit big trading partners like China, Mexico, and Canada very hard. I think about 15% of China's exports go directly to the US. Quite a lot of them go indirectly to the US because, China exports to places like Vietnam and India, where assembly is then done for export to the US. Mexico and Canada, however, would be really hard hit because they send about 80% of their exports to the US. So a 25% tariff would really clobber them. It would also clobber a lot of American companies. I mean, big American car makers manufacture some of their most popular models either in Canada or Mexico. And so it would increase the price of those vehicles by 25%, because let's remember, tariffs are not a way of collecting money from foreign countries. They are a sales tax on US consumers. And China would be affected because people would be less willing to buy cheap Chinese goods if they weren't quite so cheap, and they were having to pay a big sales tax to the US government. China is already struggling to meet its 5% growth target for this year, so an intensification of the trade war would be quite difficult. And let's stay with China for a bit. China's response to the weakness of its domestic economy as a result of the collapse of the property industry has been to really push ahead with exports and go for export-led growth, and in particular of clean technology, so solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles. And the result is a Chinese-led clean tech boom. The adoption of solar panels and grid storage have been repeatedly outstripping forecasts. I've got a very nice chart here. This is one of my favorite charts. The chart on the right here shows I would say it's a famous chart, but it's more accurate to say it's an infamous chart. On the left, you can see the collapse in the price of solar panels. On the right, this is the rate at which solar is being adopted. And what happens is forecasters, they repeatedly think that, yes, okay, there's been this surge of adoption, but now it's going to slow down. And so they constantly predict that it's going to then take the yellow line. And in fact, what happens is that adoption continues to speed up. And if you look at forecasts of solar adoption and grid storage adoption, they repeatedly have to be revised upwards. So forecasters are consistently too pessimistic about the adoption of this. This is good news for the world because it means that renewable energy technology is spreading very, very quickly, with help from the very, very low cost subsidized technology from China. Obviously, there are concerns about the world becoming too dependent on Chinese clean tech. And in both Europe and America, there have been efforts to encourage local champions to get into things like batteries and solar panels. Even while we wait for those local champions to get going, though, we might as well load up on cheap clean tech from China. It's very, very good, and you can build very, very very good solar farms with this technology. And if you look at the developing world, it's even better. We're seeing places like Pakistan where adoption of solar power is really surging. And in fact, we're seeing emissions from the electricity sector in Pakistan are now falling because so many people are fed up with paying high prices for unreliable grid electricity, and they're just buying solar panels from China and putting them on their roofs. And so there's been this extraordinary surge of development. So I think that's a good sign. And what we may see is that parts of some developing countries may just leapfrog directly to renewable energy with the help of Chinese tech, just in the same way that they leapfrog to mobile phone and mobile internet 20 years ago in telecoms, again, with the help of Chinese technology. Another piece of good news that we may get in 2025, we may discover that global greenhouse gas emissions have peaked. And this is because we're going to get the numbers from China right at the end of this month. So early in 2025, we will hear whether Chinese emissions have peaked. And because China is the world's biggest emitter, it's also, by the way, the world's most rapid adopter of renewable energy technology. It's building new solar and wind capacity at twice the rate of the rest of the world put together. So it is both a hero and a villain when it comes to climate. But because of this incredibly rapid adoption of renewables, it looks very plausible that China's emissions peaked in 2023 and have been falling in 2024. And if that's true, that will actually alter the global trajectory because China is the biggest emitter. And that would mean that global emissions may also have peaked. Now, clearly, we still have to get emissions down to net zero if we're going to get on top of climate change. And in fact, even if we get there, all we've done is stop making things get worse. So, but if we are indeed past peak emissions, then that would mean we're on our way. And even though Donald Trump is a climate skeptic, he can't stop this. An awful lot of the effort in America in the energy transition is at the city level, the state level, or the company level, and about 80% of the subsidies in the climate bill, the IRA that Joe Biden passed, actually go to Republican states. So Donald Trump is going to get a lot of pushback from Republican governors saying, actually, we'd still like that money, please. So one nice way of quantifying this is that Wood Mackenzie, a consultancy, said that the US is likely to spend $7 trillion between now and 2050 on renewable energy investment and infrastructure. And that will, because Donald Trump has now been elected, that will fall to 6 trillion. So it's still going to happen. It's just going to happen slightly more slowly than it otherwise would. But the energy transition now has momentum of its own because of the very low price of renewables. Okay, onto the economy more broadly. The rich world central bankers at Jackson Hole recently celebrated the death of inflation. Was that premature? We'll see. But I think what's starting to become apparent is that the big concern that we've had for the last few years is inflation, and now that is giving way to a different concern, which is reducing deficits. We have not heard a lot about this during the election campaigns of 2024 because you do not win an election by promising to cut deficits. So you mostly, we've heard promises to give away more things and to cut more taxes. And both candidates in the US election proposed policies that would have increased the size of the US deficit. The US deficit is now running at 6% of GDP, which means that America is spending more on debt servicing than it is on the military, which is really saying something because it's the world's biggest military spender. This is completely unsustainable, and it's not alone. Other countries also have deficits that they need to get on top of. France and Italy, in particular. In Britain, we're also trying to sort the same sort of problem out. So we are going to hear more about austerity, the need to raise taxes, to cut spending, or to boost economic growth, which, of course, if you can do it, means that you don't have to do those other two more painful options. But they're all quite difficult to do. And at the same time, many countries around the world that have big deficits are also looking to increase their defense spending because they aren't sure that they can rely on America as an ally anymore. And so this makes the crunch even worse. And this means that painful choices loom in many countries. This is one reason, by the way, why it's hard to imagine Europe stepping up to defend Ukraine if America withdraws its support, because bolstering European defense is going to require huge amounts of spending over many years, and it's really hard to see whether there's a political appetite for that. The French government has just collapsed because it can't pass a budget because nobody wants a budget that cuts spending or increases taxes. So any budget that actually tries to deal with the deficit will not get through Parliament, and it's very hard to see how you get past that. But if this wasn't difficult enough, Donald Trump's proposed policies would actually make things worse because tariffs would reduce growth across the board, and that means that you can't rely on growth. You would have to raise taxes or cut spending. And of course, Donald Trump's policies would drive up inflation in America because they are a sales tax on American consumers. In fact, people are starting to talk about the proposed 25% import tax on everything from Mexico as a guacamole tax. And furthermore, it would be a guacamole tax just before the Super Bowl. Unthinkable. America gets about half of its fruit and vegetables, fresh fruit and vegetables, from Mexico. So a 25% import tax would mean 25% increase on the price broadly that Americans pay for fruit and vegetables. There would be a currency effect in there too, but essentially this is not free money from Mexico. This is making American consumers pay more in taxes. So that would actually make all of this much worse. It threatens to reignite inflation in the US. And if there was a wider trade war, and as seems likely, other countries also imposed tariffs on their imports, then that would raise prices and reduce growth in all of those countries too. So we might find ourselves having to fight inflation again while also wanting to reduce our deficits. So this is going to be a difficult set of challenges, and in particular what Donald Trump is proposing, where he wants to cut taxes even more, but he also wants to raise tariffs, which is a different kind of tax, although he doesn't think of it like that. He thinks of it as a magic money tree that will cure all of America's problems. But that's not true, and it just doesn't add up. But I think he may only be persuaded of that if he actually gets to try it and impose some tariffs, and then we'll see where the money comes from. Age has been a big question of much interest in 2024. Joe Biden was persuaded to bow out of the presidential race because he was too old. But even so, America has just picked its oldest ever president-elect. So I think we can expect more discussion of age limits for political leaders. And in fact, North Dakota has already passed a law on this, putting an upper limit on the age of its state representatives in Congress. So that's quite interesting. We in fact looked at the ages of world leaders, and you can see on this chart here, they are overall, world leaders are getting older because the whole world is getting older. The exception is in democracies where by and large there's been this slight reduction in the average age of leaders. America is the glaring outlier to that trend. America has a lot of very old politicians, and that's largely because its political system favors incumbency and seniority, and gerrymandering of districts means that most political races are uncompetitive. So basically you can keep your seat for decades once you're elected in many parts of the country. But the rest of the democratic world looks rather different. In 1975, there was no full democracy in the world that had a leader under the age of 45. There are now 3. So there does seem to be, in places where voters get the choice of younger leaders, they do seem to be choosing them. Looking at populations as a whole, East Asia is the part of the world that's aging most quickly. And in 2025, Japan will reach a milestone. All of its baby boomer generation will be 75 or older. And that will mean that the cost of looking after them is about to really shoot up. This is what's called the 2025 problem in Japan. People over the age of 65, between 65 and 75, are generally still quite active in Japan. Many of them still work part-time and so on. And so looking after them doesn't cost that much. But that baby boom bulge is now all over 75, and the cost of looking after them is about to really shoot up. So this could be the year when Japan really starts to feel its age. China, meanwhile, is looking for economic opportunities in an aging world by promoting what it calls the silver economy. And this means making products and services for the elderly. And the idea is that if China can develop these sorts of things for the domestic market, it can then export both the services and the technology, the elder tech, as it's sometimes called, both to other countries in East Asia and around the world. Staying with technology, I think 2025 is shaping up to be a crunch year for AI. And this is because there's a very big disparity between how much money is being spent on it and how much it's actually being used. And again, I've got a couple of charts here. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see that lots of money is being spent on chips and infrastructure and servers. And in fact, the total seems to be about $1.5 trillion is being spent on AI infrastructure between 2024 and 2027. On the other hand, if you look at actual adoption in America, which you'd expect to be leading the charge, about 5% of companies say they're using AI, and about 6.5% of them say they intend to be using it in the next 6 months. So that's really not a lot of adoption. So there's quite a striking disparity between the enthusiasm among investors and technologists and actual adoption. Now, there have been some quite promising studies on how AI can boost productivity for lawyers and programmers and call center workers and consultants. But at a macroeconomic level, there's no sign of an uptick in productivity, which is what you'd expect to see, or in the rate at which people leave their jobs, which you might expect to see as a result of AI as it sort of redefines jobs and reshapes them and creates new jobs. So what's going on? I don't think this disparity between investor enthusiasm and sort of rather apathetic adoption can last. It may be that it just takes time. It may be that, companies have to get their data sort of in the right format, that they can use it with AI. They have to rethink their processes. They have to retrain workers. It may be that we're waiting for the technology to get a bit better. So one of the words of 2025 is agentic. So agent-based AI systems, which are capable of planning and executing more complex tasks. Maybe when they come along, adoption will accelerate. And, some industries are a bit further ahead. I mean, a fifth of IT firms say they're using AI. I think that's quite low for the IT industry, but it may be that it's just going to take time. But I think there's something else going on here, and that is if you look a bit closer, although a few companies say they're using AI, a third of employees in America say they're using it for work at least once a week. And in some roles, that figure's much higher. For software engineers, it's 78%. For human resources staff, it's 75%. And OpenAI, the company that makes ChatGPT, says that 3/4 of its revenue comes from consumers rather than from corporate subscriptions. So I think that means that there's an awful lot of AI use actually taking place in the office, but it's happening in secret. And workers are using it to streamline tasks, but they don't want to admit to the boss that that's what they're doing. And you can see why that is. They might worry that if they can work more efficiently using AI and they admit that that's what they're doing, they'll just get given more work, or they'll be told to train their team so that everyone can do this, so that then half of them can be fired. So I think this suggests that the adoption of AI, although we think of it as a sort of primarily a technology challenge, it's as much a cultural and management challenge as it is a technological challenge. And companies need to create an environment that incentivizes openness and experimentation rather than secrecy and suspicion. And if people are worried that showing that AI can really improve productivity might lead to reduction in headcount, then they're probably going to keep quiet about it. So I think the race to make AI more useful before investors lose their nerve is well and truly on. And that's something to watch in 2025. Next up is travel. The global movement of people and in particular tourist and business travelers faces growing friction. Conflict is disrupting global aviation as airlines avoid flying over conflict zones or over unfriendly countries. If you look at this map here, one of the examples is flying from New York to Delhi. If you fly on American, it takes 2 hours longer than if you fly on Air India. And this is because Air India is willing to fly over Russia. And I was in Asia last week and I took a very tortuous route to get to Tokyo so that I could avoid flying over Russia. And then I took a pretty tortuous route coming back from Singapore. And this kind of involves threading your way between Iran and Russia over Central Asia. and avoiding places like Ukraine and the Middle East. So it is increasingly complicated for airlines. At the same time, we're seeing things like Europe adding new border checks. So visitors to Europe from the US, for example, are going to need to get the equivalent of the US ESTA, which visitors to the US have to get. So every 3 years, I have to pay $15 or something to get an ESTA, and Europe is introducing a similar thing. Britain is also doing the same, by the way. And then something else we've seen in Europe this year has been a backlash against over tourism, as it's called. Tourist arrivals reached record levels this summer, finally rebounding back above their pre-pandemic level. And we've seen cities like Amsterdam and Barcelona, and also actually in the US, New York has done the similar thing. They've introduced restrictions on short-term rentals like Airbnb. And the concern is that that kind of rental is raising prices and reducing capacity for locals. And the over tourism protests are essentially saying that policymakers are favouring the interests of tourists rather than local people. And so we're seeing various efforts to try and discourage some kinds of tourism or to redirect it. Venice has introduced an entry fee for day trippers. Pompeii is capping daily visitors. Rome is going to charge for access to the Trevi Fountain, this sort of thing. I don't think the charges they've introduced are really large enough to make a meaningful difference, but this is the kind of thing that we're seeing. And we've actually seen protests on the streets, particularly in places like Spain, against over tourism. But really, if you look at the figures, you can see why this has happened. Tourism has rebounded from a complete collapse during the pandemic back to its pre-pandemic level. And to get back that high, the catch-up growth rate has been really extraordinary. Before the pandemic, tourist arrivals were growing at about 5% a year. The catch-up growth in the last 3 years has been at 50% a year. And that really does seem like unsustainable level of growth. But I think now that we're back to the pre-pandemic level again, we can expect the growth rate to return to a more sedate sort of pre-pandemic pace. And that may mean that the backlash against over-tourism will diminish in 2025, but the restrictions introduced by many cities like Amsterdam and Venice will remain in place. Finally, 2024 has been a surprising year. We had 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump. We had bombs hidden inside exploding walkie-talkies in Lebanon. We had a giant rocket being captured by a huge pair of chopsticks. We have Elon Musk being put in charge of a government department named after a 10-year-old dog meme. We've just had the collapse of the Syrian regime and an attempted coup in South Korea. If you'd been told all this was going to happen a year ago, you wouldn't have believed it. So I think one lesson of 2024 is to expect the unbelievable. And it suggests that maybe we should pay a bit more attention to things that sound implausible but could actually happen. So I have a selection of them in the world ahead this year. One of them is, could there be a devastating solar storm that knocks out satellites and power grids potentially for several months? And we know that these sorts of storms have happened in the past. The last really big one, though, was in 1859, when we didn't have any satellites or power grids. So we're much more dependent on technology than we used to be. Lloyd's of London, which has modelled this, says that were we to have a 1859 level solar storm again, it could cause trillions of dollars worth of damage, and it could take 5 months to get the US power grid back online. The reason I mention this now is that the sun is at solar maximum in a very active cycle, which is why there were vivid auroras in May and October of this year. And in fact, I saw the northern lights from my house in London, which is extremely unusual. And they were visible as far south as Sicily in Europe and Alabama. So that's a sign of the fact that the sun is very active, and a big storm like this in the next year is not out of the question. Other possibilities for next year include the discovery of lost ancient texts, which are being extracted from using AI from carbonized scrolls found in a Roman villa, and the deployment of new Russian space weapons. There are various frightening things that Russia has been testing. And another possibility is, in fact, a new global pandemic, this new strain of H5N1, which is spread around the world, but is also now infecting farm animals in America, is causing real concern among people who follow such things. And they're saying that this is the most likely candidate of the 30 listed by the UN for the next global pandemic. There's also this quite worrying sounding disease that no one knows what it is yet, called Disease X, in the Congo. I know we've just had a pandemic, but in retrospect, it was quite surprising that it was a century after the previous one. Another one, it's a matter of when, not if, and it may come sooner than we think. I think the broader point here is that to see the future more clearly, it can help to anticipate the unlikely. You can read more about all of these trends on our website, on our app if you're a subscriber, in the world ahead, which is available on newsstands. And I wish you the best of luck in navigating the coming year, whatever surprises it may bring. And now we can go to some Q&A.
Tom, thank you for that just expansive, broad discussion. It's very difficult to know where to start, what questions to ask, because you've covered so much territory. And I think, one of the themes of what you had to say was the uncertainty with Donald Trump coming in and being here in America. That's, to me, front and center and what I read and see every day on the news. I think with his Doge, with his government efficiency initiative, and with his discussion and saying that he can end the war in Ukraine in a day, those things and some of the other economic policies he's talked about and the efficiency, I frankly, personally believe there's a lot of enthusiasm in America today. There was a lot of apprehension before the election, and then after the election, there was angst and concern, and I think it's moved more to, even those who did not support him may have a little hint of positivity, and there may be some good things that come out of this. And we'll all have to wait and see. But it's
interesting because he's promised so many things that, I mean, pretty much anyone can say that they like some of it. So we're in the happy position now where basically you can say, well, the good news is he said he's going to do this thing that I like. There is a bit of cognitive dissonance going on here, particularly in the business community, because the business community is basically saying that they like the sound of the tax cuts and the deregulation, and who wouldn't? So they're saying they believe him on that, but they can't. But of course, they don't like the idea of the tariffs, and he can't really be serious about that. So they believe him on some of the policies, the ones they like, and they don't believe him on the ones they don't like. And this is a very happy state of affairs where you promise all things to all people, but sooner or later reality kicks in. And when he gets into the White House, he'll actually have to decide which of these things he's going to do. So yes, he's enjoying a great honeymoon now because everyone can point at the things that he said that they like the sound of. Let's get rid of income tax. That sounds great. Let's do that. But reality is going to intervene. So we'll see what happens next year.
Yeah, and I think one of your points about after inflation and the deficits and needing to cut spending, having some sort of fiscal discipline is going to be challenging. Elon Musk says he can cut $2 trillion. I don't think the numbers show that can happen.
I can't imagine. Well, you could cut the military. That would be a bit. I mean, there isn't really much scope for cuts to non-discretionary spending. So yeah, 2 trillion is insane. If he means 2 trillion in total over 10 years, then we think that you could just about do that. But that's not what he's talking about. So again, that sounds great. And it's one of these promises like getting rid of income tax. I mean, you can promise anything you like on the campaign, but as I say, year of expectations. The big question is what's he actually going to deliver?
Right, and I think part of the reason for example, Bitcoin moving up is number one, there's going to be less difficult regulatory environment for Bitcoin with changes at the SEC here in America. But at the same time, I think there's concern about the deficits, and it's more of a store of value. It's not going to be an alternative currency, but it is
I don't know what's going on there.
Similar to gold, maybe is the way.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a speculative asset. I think the the industry has been calling for it says it's been calling for clear regulation. What it means is less regulation, because it's obviously Bitcoin is regulated by the SEC as a security now, which is quite an onerous way of doing it. I don't think that the lack of adoption of Bitcoin is because it's over-regulated, and I don't think cutting regulation on it is going to mean more people adopt it. I think it's going to be a scammer's charter. And I mean, you've also seen the Bitcoin lobby has made this proposal that the Federal Reserve should buy an enormous amount of Bitcoin and promise not to sell it for 50 years or something like that. You can see why they're saying that, because that would be great for them, because then they would have a guaranteed, that either they could sell it to the Federal Reserve or that the price of it wouldn't go down. So there's a lot of self-dealing going on here, and I wouldn't read too much into that. And certainly I'm steering very, very clear of Bitcoin myself. So yeah, I don't think that tells you anything, except that the Bitcoin crowd thinks they're going to get whatever they want. And this takes us back to Donald Trump has told everyone that they can have whatever they want, but they can't all have all of the things that he's promised. So what's actually going to happen, we'll find out.
Yeah, well, and really your final point, the life of, it's a life of surprises, and there will be surprises. We can't sit here and forecast. I mean, who would have guessed what's happened in Syria,
Yeah.
2 weeks ago?
No, exactly. Astonishing change. Yeah, exactly. So we're bound to be. So what I'm trying to do is just sort of say, well, let's go into the year expecting, big unexpected surprises, and what could they be? And here are some examples, and some of them are political, earthquakes. Could Putin's regime collapse that quickly? Who knows? I mean, it looked as though it was when there was that rebellion against him a few months ago. But then also I think we should remember, there are surprises that can come from natural sources, so earthquakes, volcanoes, solar storms. We tend to sort of assume that the surprises are things within our control or within politics or whatever, but they can come from other places too.
Right, and with the situation in Syria, it's really apparently it's hurting Russia. It's weakening them. It's weakening Iran and Iran's influence. And there's even talk now that there could be an uprising in Iran out of this. And so, and then so you've got those sort of political surprises, and then you've got as you mentioned, the big solar storm. I mean, you could have an earthquake in California, which could cause. And there's going to be one at some point.
Exactly. We all know it's going to come sooner or later, but when it comes, it will be a big surprise. So yeah, who knows?
Yeah. So another topic that you mentioned, is age, and I think it's going to be particularly interesting in this country to see the changes in the political parties, because Donald Trump, while he is the oldest incumbent president ever, you look at the people that he's trying to appoint to these various positions, and they're all younger, dynamic in their own way.
Absolutely. I mean, what's surprising about his cabinet, it's surprisingly diverse in all senses of the word. There's a range of ages, there's a range of political affiliations. I mean, RFK is kind of, he agrees with Bernie Sanders on quite a lot of things. So yes, it's what the geopolitical analysts say about this is that when you have a world leader who has a very broad spectrum of advisors, which Donald Trump does, and in fact some of them are like even divided against themselves. So Elon Musk is in favor of regulation of AI because he's worried that it's going to kill everyone, but he also thinks that California's attempt to regulate AI because it's going to kill everyone went too far. So he's simultaneously arguing for less regulation and more regulation of AI. So, but anyway, the people around Trump have a wide range of views, and that means that the geopolitical analysts, their view on this is that the broader the range of advisors and the range of advice, then the broader the range of potential outcomes. And that's, one of the things that, again, points us to this radical Trumpian uncertainty that we're seeing for 2025.
Yeah, and I also think it's actually going to be more interesting to see what happens to the Democratic Party, because you've got Biden, who is very old, and then you've got Obama and Clinton's, and they're passing on, and you've got other leaders in the Senate and the House So it'll be interesting to see how that party transitions to a younger generation and how they come together. So another topic that we've talked about is tariffs, and I personally believe that Trump is using that as leverage more than implementing them. Although he may implement heavy tariffs against China, I don't think he's going to do that with Mexico and Canada. And I think it's a negotiating point on his part. And I think with the Ukraine war, that's going to be really interesting to see. I think they're already having discussions. He's met with Zelensky, and I think with Europe's role in NATO and whether Ukraine could become part of NATO and the US could protect it for a period of time, give up 20% of the territory to Russia, not totally forever, but for a time period. I don't know. I think that will be also an interesting.
Well, Putin is not taking that deal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, can you make him take a deal? I don't know, but yes. I mean, it's interesting what Zelensky's been saying. He's saying he would accept exactly the deal you proposed, I think, because the majority of people in Ukraine want the war to end now. And he said, if you put us into NATO and into the EU, we can be a thriving European democracy, and then we can resolve the status of Eastern Ukraine later on by diplomatic means. And he has in mind the reunification of Germany, of course, which was not achieved by by force or by a war. It was because the Soviet Union collapsed and the wall came down. And actually, the wall came down first, but essentially it was political change rather than military change that led that to happen. So that's the kind of thing he has in mind. But yes, I think NATO, Ukraine in NATO is something that this is essentially what Putin fought the war to try to prevent. So, and the last thing he wants is a thriving democracy on his doorstep, because again, that's embarrassing for him, because it suggests that Russia under different leadership could be a thriving democracy as well, and that's the thing he can't stand, and the reason he invaded the country. So yeah, it's very hard to see how you get the two sides to the same place. I think Henry Kissinger had a very nice expression for this. It was something like the balance of disappointment. So you don't get an agreement because everyone likes it. You get an agreement because everyone is equally disappointed by it. So I think finding the balance of disappointment will be the key there. But yes, if it means that the fighting comes to an end, then I think both sides are exhausted, and so let's hope some sort of deal that everyone is prepared to go along with can be struck.
One of the things that I think is critically important for the growth of the world and increasing productivity and increasing life living quality is energy. And you talked about that some, and specifically about the solar exports from China and electric vehicles, which are not being adopted in this country.
Oh, yes, they are.
Well,
sales of EVs are at a record level in the US.
Yeah, but they're at such a low starting point. Ultimately, they will grow and continue to grow. But I think from an energy standpoint, I don't think we're going to go away from oil and gas. I think that's going to continue to be, just
forever.
Just like coal. Coal is
right. So you think we're going to have carbon emissions from fossil fuels forever?
I do.
So the temperature of the world will continue to increase forever.
Well, I'm not.
You don't think it? You don't think that burning fossil fuels is affecting the temperature?
I'm not qualified to.
Okay. Do you think it's affecting the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Because that's definitely going up.
Yes.
We're at 450 ppm. Okay, right. So we're really down to arguing about what the climate sensitivity is, which is how much does more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere affect the temperature? And that is a reasonable argument to have, and scientists are doing a lot of work on trying to work out what's called the climate sensitivity of the atmosphere is. The debate is currently whether doubling the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere leads to 2 degrees Celsius of warming or 5. It's somewhere in the range. We don't know where. but it's definitely more than zero. So
Yeah.
if we're going to go on burning fossil fuels, then the planet's going to go on getting hotter forever. So I just don't see how that's
Well, we have to transition away from them, and
right.
where I
So
was headed, where
so
I
the
was
general
headed.
plan is transition away by 2050, and we might just keep the temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So that
Right.
is the net zero plan, and I think that's a reasonable plan. And yes, it does involve burning some fossil fuels between now and then, but ultimately we need to move aircraft over to synthetic fuels, which you can make using renewable energy. The hard things to decarbonize, like steel making and cement making, we need to find different processes that don't use natural gas and
So
don't
I
use
was going to
fossil
ask
fuels.
you, what is your view of nuclear? Really, is where I was headed with this, because
Nuclear is all right, but it's very, very expensive is the problem. And the problem with it's got more expensive since the 70s. You'd have thought that when we build more things, we get better at them, but with nuclear, we seem to be getting worse. And the generation of people who knew how to build nuclear power stations in the 70s have largely retired. So if you're starting today and you want emission-free energy, you would just go with renewables. You would go with solar and wind because they are incredibly cheap. They are much. I mean, they're cheaper than natural gas in much of the world already, and they're definitely cheaper than nuclear. So I'm a big fan of nuclear. Where you've already got the power stations, you should keep them on. And what Germany did was really stupid, turning them off. In America, several of the old power stations are going to be turned on again. So 3 Mile Island is actually going to be turned on again to power Microsoft data centers. So where you've got them, sweat the assets and use them. But building new ones, it doesn't make sense. If you're building new capacity, you should build renewable capacity. And this is what, a lot of America is doing, what Texas is doing, what California is doing. What people used to say was, oh, well, it's too expensive, and what happens if the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine? That argument has now gone away because battery storage and grid storage is being adopted faster even than solar. It's now the fastest growing energy technology. So you can use that to smooth out the fluctuations in renewable sources. So they really, if you're building a power station now from scratch, you just do it with renewables. It doesn't make any economic sense to do anything else.
yeah. One final thing, one of the big topics in America for the election was the immigration problem that we've had, and I think a solution to dealing with it rather than mass deportations was, how do you eat an elephant? Well, it's one bite at a time. And the first thing you do is you send the criminals back to the countries from where they came. And tell me about, and so I wanted to ask you about the issue, which I don't appreciate, in Europe and England, because we see these film clips of the Muslims issues in London and so forth, and that's where you live. What talk to
Yeah,
us?
I haven't seen any. I don't know what film clips you're looking at. I mean, we have the right to protest, so you do get protest marches through London about various things, and some of them are people protesting about, I don't know, what's happening in Gaza or whatever. So, but I mean, there is no rioting in the street going on. I know that right-wing politicians in America like to talk about no-go areas and how you can't walk the streets. This just isn't true. So that's not the case. Yes, you can start with the criminals if you like, but the idea that you can identify 1 million people who are actually rapists and murderers from Mexico and chuck them out, there aren't. You can't identify them, and the number is very small. In fact, immigrants commit fewer crimes per capita than native-born Americans. So I know they say they're going to start with the really bad people, but they'll probably find 50 or something who have definitely got criminal records. I mean, I just don't see how that's going to work. But I'm sure there'll be some very flashy attempt to do a large-scale deportation that will get stopped either by the courts or by some other legal means, and then Donald Trump will say that the deep state has thwarted him. That's what I'm expecting to happen. But people expect him to do something on that, so they probably will. The other thing that's happening in Europe is what's called instrumentalization of refugees and migrants, and this is where Russia, for example, stirs up trouble in the Sahel region of Central Africa, in the knowledge that this will drive refugees north, and they will then try to get into Europe across the Mediterranean. And
Yeah.
then Europe will have an argument about how to deal with them. And Italy will say, for example, why do we have to deal with this just because we're nearest to the coast of Libya? We should share them out. And then they will get into a fight with other European powers. And this is serving Vladimir Putin's agenda, which is to divide Europe. So that it can't stand up to him and his various, meddling in other things. So that's one of the patterns that we see. We have some illegal immigration to this country across the channel. We have a much higher level of legal migration because we do grant, and in fact we have, despite all governments saying they're going to cut it, we have actually quite high levels of legal migration. One of the reasons that the US economy has done unexpectedly well in 2024 is because of the level of migration. It supplies massive immigration. It supplies massive amounts of labor. And what you'll see if there is a serious attempt to deport large numbers of people, you'll see certain industries like hospitality and fruit picking saying, where are we going to get our labor from? This is going to put up prices. And that sort of thing. So, I mean, large-scale immigration, I know there are, it's very politically unpopular, but economically, it's been extremely good for America, and it's the reason why the American economy has performed so unexpectedly well in the last couple of years.
Well, a lot of food for thought here, and a lot of uncertainty. So maybe we can come back and recap at this time next year and see what's occurred.
Indeed. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Standage and Mr. Douglas, for this important conversation about what might be ahead in 2025 worldwide. The program will be archived and available on tnwac.org very soon. Consider becoming a member and a donor supporting Tennessee World Affairs Council to carry out its mission through all events and projects on global affairs. Happy holidays for everyone, and thank you all, and goodbye for now.
Oh.